Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As the year 2023 begins to draw to a close, so I thought it would be important to reflect a little bit about where our world has ended up at the end of 2023, as we've been tracking through Humanity Rising. For all of those of you who track us on a regular basis, we try to keep up with world events. We try to understand the connections between different kinds of human and ecological activities. We cover a range of subjects. And I've been thinking, particularly in light of the recent developments in UAP disclosure, of what the world is coming to at this moment. And so today I'd like to just share some reflections as I've gone through a sort of a mental exercise of, if I was an ET and I'd just come on planet Earth and I was observing the human species as we comport ourselves in various ways around this globe of ours, what conclusions would I draw from an anthropological point of view? And I've gone through this exercise because it appears from everything we know after observing this phenomenon for about 80 years is that that's the principal activity of the extraterrestrials. They've been very privately, very quietly, unobtrusively, except on various specific, and I would say notable occasions, simply observing. They've abducted a number of us and subjected us to tests like we do animals in the wild when we catch things, scientifically trying to understand what is this little critter and what capacities do they have and deficiencies do they have. So I've been thinking, if they were going to take over the world, what is the world that they're in the process of establishing contact with? They're highly technological. So the first thing that they would observe is that we are rapidly becoming extremely technologically sophisticated and pervasively dependent on our machines. And one of the characteristics of our technologized world is not only are we developing capacities through engineering, mathematics, science, and technology of shaping our world, we're also in the process of creating massive global surveillance. It's very interesting. Privacy is rapidly disappearing on planet Earth. Virtually every move we make, whether in public or in private, whether in a community or as an individual, is being constantly monitored all the time through every means of communication and exploration at our disposal. We all have cell phones. Every text, every WhatsApp chat, every video call, every Zoom call, every telephone conversation is monitored and recorded and put in the archive. All of our computers, every aspect of human technology is an information retrieval system as 8 billion human beings, most preponderantly in the highly industrialized societies, have not only lost their personal privacy, but they've been turned into commodities. I think that would be very interesting to any alien investigators and observers to see, after hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary development on the part of the human species. We've created machines that are stripping us of the very sanctity of privacy. The second thing that the ETs would observe is, while humans are endlessly creative, mostly in developing technology gadgets, but more profoundly, artificial intelligence, that we've now begun the process of imparting biological intelligence into machines, so that not only are we allowing our machines to know virtually every aspect about us, and it is said frequently that Facebook knows more about your best friend, maybe even your significant other, than you do, because they're watching all the time. And now we're proceeding to give over to our machines unlimited intelligence and capaciousness. And with general artificial intelligence, our machines are now talking amongst themselves using language that humanity doesn't understand, and making decisions outside the parameter of the programmers. So that's another aspect that the aliens are observing about what's going on right now. Thirdly, they would observe that even though through the internet, individuals and voluntary communities have access to unlimited information, can organize all around the world, can communicate with almost anybody anywhere if you can figure out a way to get to them. Our governments are exercising increasing totalitarian control. It's a very interesting phenomenon that the genesis of the internet, which gives the possibility of radical democratization, is also giving rise to radical totalitarianism. And as we've all seen through COVID, through news coverage of Ukraine, of Gaza, just to name a few, how the governments, in an alignment with the technology companies, have been choreographing the information that the masses receive. And it's harder and harder, especially in the democracies, to find independent journalism. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I've mentioned before the term totalitarian democracy. We're allowed to vote every few years. But no matter who you vote for, the government wins. And that's the sad truth of not only American democracy, but I would say democracies around the world. which are increasingly endangered, not because of the rising authoritarian tyrants, which is sort of the classical way that democracies were overthrown. But democracy is on the endangered species list because of the rise of technology and the capacity of our governing elites to use technology to control the information through CNN and MSNBC and BBC and Deutsche Telekom and French TV and Indian TV and Chinese TV. All the governments understand that what people think is true governs what they believe and how they act. So it's critical to control the information flow. They don't even have to put you in jail anymore, although they do. They don't even have to kill you many times anymore, but they do. What they normally do is just take you off of social media. You kill dissent, not through imprisonment, but taking people off of YouTube and Facebook or Zoom. And then their voice becomes anonymous, and there's no way for anyone to hear or understand what they're saying. So as these aliens are observing the human race, they're seeing an increasingly technologized, increasingly coherently organized informational system that is shaping the beliefs of all the citizens in different ways, given where you are around the world. But all the governments are in on it because they have access now to all of our information. So they know pretty much exactly how to treat us and what to feed us in order to maintain control. It's a really extraordinary moment in human history. And then I was reflecting further, what else would the ETs observe on planet Earth right now from a political, sociological level? Well, one of the things that they would be observing is that the greatest power on Earth, the United States of America, whose empire over the last 100 years has circumnavigated the planet with 800, 900, at one point after the Second World War, the United States had 1,200 military bases linked around the world. It's now down to roughly 800, about 250 to 300 of which ring China and are arrayed against Russia in Europe and stretch into Latin America. The United States has military bases in over 120 countries around the world. That's how pervasive the military presence of the United States is. But the aliens would observe that this empire is convulsing in the last stages of its imperial arc. The US Imperium is literally collapsing right before our eyes by engaging in what collapsing empires almost invariably do, and that is to egregiously engage in senseless wars at vast expense, which they lose. The United States lost in Vietnam. The United States lost in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Most of the wars in which the United States has engaged in the last 50, 60 years, it's lost. It's in the process right now of losing in Ukraine. Ukraine's army is collapsing, and the Russian army is advancing all across the eastern and southern part of Ukraine. you're beginning to hear about it a little bit in the Western press, because one of the extraordinary things about democracy and totalitarianism, and privacy, and a variety of other human endeavors is that one of the most constant verities in history is that truth will out. And so we're watching the United States and its military effort to destroy Russia, to weaken Russia through its proxy war in Ukraine. We're seeing that collapse. And the Ukrainian people are waking up to that reality. It's very interesting what's going on in Ukraine right now, because the Ukrainian army is in a state of collapse. They've run out of money. They've run out of ammunition. Their air force no longer functions in any kind of capable way. Their technology and economic infrastructure is in a state of collapse. They've spent everything they can on a senseless offensive over the last 6 months against the Russian Saravikian line. And after 6 months of credible effort using the best technology that the US and Britain and France and Germany and the NATO alliance could provide, the irresistible force of US military hardware was shattered against the immovable object of Russian defenses. And now, as Russia begins to move into areas of Ukraine, the Ukrainians don't have the capacity to build defensive lines. And that's why Zelensky and Biden are desperately trying to get the US Congress to come up with another 60 billion, which is half of the 120 billion the US gave to Ukraine last year. And even if they're given 60 billion, it won't make any difference, because the geostrategic realities of what's going on in Ukraine is that the Russians have won. The Russian defenses, which stood against Napoleon, which stood against Hitler, have stood against the United States. And President Biden is moving into an election year, which I'll get into more deeply in a few minutes. And we'll have to explain how and why he lost Ukraine. The United States is also embroiled in the Middle East in one of the most shocking acts of cruelty and barbarism, certainly of the 21st century, but we haven't seen anything like this since the Nazis 100 years ago in Germany, as the Israelis do to the Palestinians what the Germans did to the Jews in the 1930s. And we're watching hospitals, schools, mosques, UN centers obliterated by blanket bombing of population centers, as the Israeli government, not only Netanyahu, but ministers in the Israeli government, call for the complete obliteration of the population of Gaza. And every bullet, every tank, every bomb, every aircraft is made in the USA. So the consternation against the United States by the rest of the world, which has largely supported Russia and is overwhelmingly in support of the Palestinians, has begun to identify the United States as a pariah among the nations. You probably noted the vote in the UN General Assembly yesterday, overwhelmingly calling for a ceasefire. A few days before, the United States was the only country to vote against it in the Security Council. And so they brought it to the General Assembly. And out of 170 nations in the UN General Assembly, only 9 voted with the United States against the resolution for at least a ceasefire. So that's another major aspect of our world right now, that in the midst of technological centralization, government controls, the imperium that has dominated world affairs and world politics for the last 100 years is in an advanced state of collapse. And kind of senselessness that defies belief. And it's within this context that I want to talk about next year as we turn to 2024 and the reality that in November, just about a year from now, a little less, 11 months from now, the United States is going to have an election with a president that may have been impeached by then, because the House of Representatives is preparing a formal investigation of impeachment against President Joe Biden that looks like it is moving forward now. His son, Hunter Biden, has been subpoenaed by the House of Representatives. And I would note that Donald Trump's first impeachment was due to a scandal in Ukraine. And Joe Biden will probably be impeached, if not convicted, for a scandal involving Ukraine. Ukraine has been a great tar pit that has signaled not only the death knell of the American imperium, but the corruption of the last 2 presidents of the United States in that tar. Extraordinary to think about how Ukraine has so sullied international relations and given rise not only to a new perception of the fragility of the United States, but how Russia and China and India and South Africa and Saudi Arabia and Brazil, countries all over the world, Iran, are now rising into a new coalition of the BRICS plus as the world turns away from the American hegemon into another, I would say, Chinese-dominated order of the Belt and Road based on commerce and amity and collegiality without military and economic coercion. So we're moving into the election of 2024, where this is going to come into play. And it's so fascinating to me as a historian that Donald Trump is running explicitly to be a dictator. He says it without apology on Fox News and is defended by the commentators of the right. And if you've read Plato's Republic, this is always how democracies succumb because of their inability to govern themselves. That's why Plato was opposed to democracy. He felt it was an extraordinary instrumentality of governance But as he watched the Athenian democracy succumb to the Peloponnesian War, and in their day, perpetual war, he said, if you engage in perpetual war, you violate the truth and you succumb to the demagoguery of the tyrant. And that's what Trump is. And Trump has risen up in the American polity right at that moment of societal and imperial collapse, which, according to the history of empires, it's what happened to Rome. It's what happened to the Ottomans. You can just count the empires as they collapsed. A strong man would emerge, promising to make America great again. And that would usher in the final collapse of a system that was no longer elastic enough, to borrow that phrase from Arnold Toynbee, from his study of history, was no longer elastic enough to adapt to changing circumstances. And so it collapses on itself. And I think that one of the first enactments of that collapse is going to happen over the next several years as the BRIC nations take world trade away from the dominance of the US dollar. I've spoken about this before, but watch the dollar, watch the news. Nation after nation after nation is stopping to use the dollar and starting to use local currency, starting to use the ruble, starting to use the Chinese yuan as currencies of trade. Iraq just went off the dollar. And that effect is going to be highly corrosive on the American economy and financial system, and ultimately on the American way of life. There is no way under current circumstances that the United States, which is 4.5% of the world's population, can continue to consume upwards of 20% of the world's goods and services. That is about ready to go the way of all flesh. And the 2024 election is going to be an extraordinarily chaotic, as Joe Biden caught in the tar pit of Ukraine, as it collapses, caught in the tar pit of Israel's butchery of the Palestinians, becomes increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, which accelerates the desertion of the US dollar and US primacy. And then an election that the world will behold as Donald Trump, with 91 criminal indictments, gets the Republican nomination against the Democratic president that's enmeshed in one scandal after another and is no longer capable of the kind of intellectual dexterity or verbal oratory that can turn things around. And so it's in the middle of all that that we have this UAP disclosure and the opportunity to radically reframe human consciousness at the moment where the infrastructure, the sinews, the interstices of Western civilization itself, epitomized by US imperial primacy, is collapsing right in front of our eyes. And the East and Asia begins to rise. And this bill that's being passed by the Senate and the House of Representatives today and tomorrow, before they go off on their holiday recess on Friday, on the 15th, is an extraordinary moment and opportunity. And I'd like to conclude by talking a little bit about that in terms of, I would say, the metaphysical and philosophical implications of disclosure. When the bill is passed, the US government will have put its imprimatur on the reality that UAP technology and UAP biological entities exist, and that this information needs to get to the National Archives and to the American public and to the world public. So what does that mean? What that means is that we have an opportunity to be midwives into humanity's ET moment. What's happening this week will be remembered in 1,000 years as the moment in the midst of the vicissitudes of historical development. The major government of the world, in its process of collapse, ushered in humanity's contact with extraterrestrials. It's a phenomenal moment to be alive. And it gives all of us something to do in the midst of all this. And that's what I've been thinking about as the director of the Washington office of the New Paradigm Institute. Now that we've got the law in place, as you know, we didn't get everything we wanted. Did we want, eminent domain? Did we want subpoena power? Did we want various instrumentalities of timelines? Absolutely. We didn't get it. The military, industrial, fossil fuel industry managed to eviscerate much of the amendment, but they didn't succeed in destroying the amendment. Why? Because the truth will out. There's enough people now in the US Senate and the US House of Representatives that know that extraterrestrials exist and that they've been on planet Earth, and that the United States government has upwards of 12 aircraft that were flown in from outer space, and dozens of biological entities that come from somewhere besides planet Earth. And that evidence is sufficiently well known and documented that the cat is out of the bag. The toothpaste is out of the tube. And we're at that moment. So I want to make two observations about that because I think it's something that all of us can do, because this is one of those moments, it's like the Christ event. If you'd have been alive in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, you could have spent your time as an olive merchant, or you could have sold wine in the bazaars. You could have traded with the Bedouin in the desert. But wouldn't you rather have spent time with Jesus of Nazareth and hung out with him on the Mount of Olives or by the Sea of Galilee, walked along the Jordan River listening to his teachings? That was the event. Or if you'd have been in England around 1215 for the Magna Carta, that great seminal moment in the history of democracy where the land barons challenged King John of England and said, we're not going to pay taxes unless we have some kind of representation. And we're going to limit your power. The Magna Carta has stood for 1,000 years. If you were alive at that moment, Wouldn't you have liked to have been with the robber barons sitting in that tent with John, King John, and just listening to what was happening? This is that moment in human history. This will be written about by historians and the various personalities, like during the American Revolution or the French Revolution. They know all the stories of all the people who came together at that moment and transacted the revolutionary impulse in America in 1776 to 1783 during the Revolutionary War. Well, there's individuals that are going to be part of that. And we now have an opportunity in the midst of all the technological centralization and authoritarian and imperial collapse and chaos in our world, to start spreading the message that the law has been passed of enormous historic, strategic importance, that we are not alone. And the implications of this have to be worked out at every level of society. Think about it for a moment. What does extraterrestrial presence on planet Earth mean for the education system? How do you start telling little kids in the first grade, little Johnny and little Susie, about extraterrestrials? What do you tell them? What does the local city council, what does the local university, what does the local Rotary Club or Lions Club, what do all of us need to start thinking about now that we know that it's not if UFOs exist, but since UFOs exist? What does that imply for the very humanity that we embody? All of us need to go through this process. And that's one reason why the New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity University, which is setting up a whole school of science and consciousness just to really work on this issue. We're developing a training program so that it'll be available to all of you starting in the new year. How do we understand the history? Because the most closely guarded secret in history around UFOs is now coming into the light of day. What's true? How and when did it all happen? What are the technologies that they've been trying to reverse engineer? How do you communicate with the ETs? How do we begin to recalibrate the meaning of humanity as citizens of the galaxy? How do we rework our religious traditions? Is Jesus still the only incarnation of God in a vastness of the cosmos with trillions of galaxies and billions of life forms? Who is the Buddha in all that? What does the Quran mean on Alpha Centauri? As our categories of cognition and the scope of our epistemologies are literally exploded. How do we go back and rework our traditions? I had a fascinating conversation with several people in various religions as they were just taking in the enormity of what this means. And one of the things we're going to be doing on Humanity Rising as 2024 unfolds, we're going to be bringing philosophers and historians and theologians and intellectuals to just say, these are the questions that human beings need to be fathoming. We're appealing to the US government, since the committees in Congress, in the House and the Senate, are in fact overseeing this process of disclosure. How does the US government, how does the British government, how does the French government, the Chinese government, the Brazilian government, the Indian government, how do they begin to work through the implications on governance now that extraterrestrials are taken as real? And we begin to wake up to the fact that they are here in a very serious way. We're not talking about an isolated extraterrestrial, landing in Roswell, New Mexico, and then you don't hear about anything for the next 50 years. The extraterrestrials have been everywhere. They've been studying us. They've been abducting people. They've been creating hybrids. They've been building bases. They're here for a reason. And we need to understand that reason. And it's my deepest hope that as we lift our eyes to the stars and as we begin to take in the gravity of what it is that we're now moving into, we will look at the wars and the pettiness of our consumerism and the completely delusional way we use social media for the most inane things, and begin as a human species to ask ourselves some fundamental questions of who and what we need to be to qualify for our ET moment. Because we won't survive our ET moment if we keep acting like we're acting against each other and against the planetary ecology. That's what the ETs have been saying. So starting in 2024, I'd like all of us to think about how we can start taking this message out to wherever you are, whatever community you're in. Show them the bill. We're going to put it up on our website. You just download the bill and show it to people. And what does this mean for us? So I believe that even in the face of the greatest crisis of modernity, as the world convulses with chaos and destruction all around, that something is emerging far greater than the crises that we face. And that is the opportunity to completely re-understand what it means to be human in a cosmic context. And then spread the word as far and wide as we can and generate the kinds of questions that are actually befitting the intelligence we've been given by our Creator. This isn't the be-all and end-all of reality, the next iPhone. The be-all and end-all of reality is how do we take our place in the cosmic scheme of things as representatives of our beautiful planet as we make cosmic contact, knowing the only way for us to succeed in that task is to begin to love each other, to love all sentient beings, to love the planetary ecology, and come to into a symbiotic, harmonious relationship with our fellow species our Mother Earth as we begin deep awareness and communications with extraterrestrial intelligences. That's our task beginning in 2024. And I'm delighted to be able to be with you all during this process, because it's going to be very, very exciting as we build the first ET global movement in history. So thank you, everyone. I think I'll leave it at that. I hope that I gave you some food for thought. And I think we'll maybe close out now. I'll join the after chat. So if any of you want to carry on this discussion in the after chat, please do. I think these kinds of discussions are better directly and informally, where we can see each other. You'll see the link in the chat box. You'll also receive the Zoom in your Zoom reminder for the session today. The link to the after chat is embedded in the reminder. So thank you, everyone. And then tomorrow, we have Danny Sheehan again. And Danny's going to come on and he's going to give us an analysis of what's going on in Washington, what's in store for the U.S. government and for the world community, as only Danny Sheehan, a constitutional litigator par excellence, who I count as probably my oldest, certainly, and one of my dearest friends, going back 50 years when we met back during our Harvard days. He'll be with us tomorrow to talk more deeply about the UAP disclosure bill and the consequences and implications. So thank you, everyone. See you in the after chat. Bye for now.